As a Singaporean, I've known about the fundamental histories of Singapore for a while. However, I've always wondered if this little red dot had a hidden history that few were aware of. Now Singapore is known as the Lion City, a first world country of diverse cultures. In its history, it has experienced British colonization and Japanese expansionism. But Singapore was also the location of a major tipping point in Southeast Asian history. In 1942, the British suffered an overwhelming tragedy at the hands of the Japanese. However, this was also an enduring triumph of Asian sovereignty that turned the tide of 500 years of European colonialism. The British had implemented their own policies of government and education, and in doing so, they set themselves up for the loss of Singapore. One of Singapore's national heroes was born during this period. Let's go back to the early 20th century and look at the life of Lim Bo Seng, a Singaporean Chinese activist and businessman. He was fortunate enough to be born into a very wealthy family in 1900 Singapore. Construction, cookies, and cash, they had it all. But his generation was particularly significant in that they received liberal British education. He went to school in Raffles Institute, a government-aided school, where he learned subjects such as English, arithmetic, philosophy, and history. Then he grew to be an extremely influential community leader, taking part in the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Kuomintang Party, to name a few. While he was alive, Singapore was a bustling trade city where textiles and other such materials changed hands between Asian and Caucasian merchants alike. Since Singapore had a long history of being a center of trade even prior to British control, a wealthy merchant class had already been established. Powerful leaders such as Lim Bo Seng prevented the British from taking full control over Singapore and exploiting the colony. Moreover, the British authorities did not attempt to oppress the Chinese majority, giving them the freedom to participate in international trade. The pre-established economic system, mostly headed by Chinese merchants, allowed Singapore to continue supporting its economy after independence. However, there was a darker part of Singapore that Lim Bo Seng was not involved in. Secret societies, commonly abbreviated as SS, influenced a large part of the Singaporean society and economy because they provided a home for Chinese immigrants entering Singapore. Out of every 100 people, one would be part of a secret society.
Yes, there are different gangs of secret societies. You see, they get protection monies from those hawkers, shopkeepers, and they have fights. See, gang clashes. There are certain fights between different two gangs or three gangs like that. Each gang will control different parts of the area.
These secret societies were economically influential in that they helped Chinese merchants in Singapore compete against foreigners. They did this by intimidating Chinese laborers into complying with the coolie trade. They also ignored British laws and adhered only to their own systems of order.
Oh, yeah. These gangs have tattoos or numbers to say which gang they belong to. And I can name a few. That means the gangs from 18, 24, 36, and a few others, you see.
Their trading and extensive network of Chinese immigrants benefited Singapore economically. These merchants' work created a stable economy for Singapore that was able to sustain the colony even after independence, proving that the British were not any stronger or smarter than Asian authority.
At the same time, Chinese Singaporeans such as Lim were deeply involved in a more pressing matter: anti-Japanese activism. Lim had organized a strike of 2,300 workers from a Japanese mining company, which temporarily closed down the mine and persuaded many workers to move to Singapore. While this seemed insignificant to British power at the time, it proved the capability of local leaders, which would later help them gain strong support in post-war Singapore. Meanwhile, the British had constructed their own worldview, in which their military strength was far superior to the Asian armies.
Throughout the Pacific are communities enjoying freedom and prosperity under British rule. For instance, Fiji.
Singapore's colonial governor, Sir Shenton Thomas, even went so far as to call Japanese soldiers in World War II little men and say they suffered from night blindness. Churchill, the British public, and local Singaporeans were all under the illusion that Singapore's defenses were impenetrable to the Japanese forces. However, even prior to the Battle of Singapore, Asian powers were often looked down upon. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 saw the first instance of an Asian country defeating a Western power. After a year of fighting, Russia experienced a military defeat at the hands of the Japanese. Still, the confidence for victory in battle caused the British to neglect their troops, so much that a veteran remarked that even basic barbed wire was lacking. Their victory can partially be attributed to the incredible organization of the Japanese armies.
I got visions of them flying overhead, 27 of them, all in groups of 3, nines and 3 sets of nines. Perfect formation. They were flying over us towards Singapore. Dominated the skies. That was a real plus for them.
Due to Britain's strong navy, they prepared only for defending Singapore's coast, and the thought of invasion by land didn't even cross their mind. They believed so strongly in their superiority over the Japanese that they let the Japanese army bike in from Malaysia unchallenged. The results were catastrophic. This surrender was the biggest military tragedy in British history, with the capture of at least 80,000 Allied troops. This was particularly staggering, considering the Japanese only had 30,000 troops and limited resources. Their undeniable triumph was an obvious indicator that the belief in white supremacy was unfounded. On the 15th of February, Churchill's commander-in-chief received a telegram from General Percival, who was based in Singapore. Owing to losses from enemy action, water, petrol, food, and ammunition practically finished, unable therefore to continue the fight any longer. All ranks have done their best and are grateful for your help. The esteemed Winston Churchill was staggered by what he deemed to be the worst disaster and largest capitulation in all of British history. Even months after Singapore fell, Churchill was still scarred by the military tragedy.
I speak to you all under the shadow of a heavy and far-reaching military defeat. It is a British and imperial defeat. Singapore has fallen.
When World War II ended, Singapore was given back to the British. It was at this point that the wealthy locals' liberal education came into play. The nationalist techniques they had previously used against Japanese expansionism were again incorporated into anti-colonialism efforts, especially since the British had proved themselves to be incompetent.
The idea of Singapore's independence took root and began to flourish. Citizens began to doubt the legitimacy of the negligent British authority, especially since local Asian leaders had already gained their trust. A political party called the Barisan Socialists even went so far as to criticize the entire parliamentary system for being phony.
An article published in the Palladium Express reads, "It is necessary for us to discover and understand the true nature of this so-called democracy which is being peddled to us by the stooges of Anglo-American imperialists and colonialists."
After the British allowed locals to occupy colonial government positions, citizens' involvement in the government saw a rapid increase. In 1965, Singapore gained independence under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew.
The success of Singapore as an independent nation-state proved that the Asian community was not dependent on a foreign government. As a result, the community was able to develop into the self-reliant nation-states that we see today.
Additionally, after the fall of Singapore, Southeast Asia saw a period of rapid decolonization, including modern-day countries such as India, Malaya, and Myanmar. Ultimately, the fall of Singapore was a consequence of British arrogance, coupled with the secret society's economic support and the Japanese sense of Pan-Asianism. Singapore was the prime location for Southeast Asian triumph over white supremacy. At a glance, Singapore's historical significance would go unnoticed to the casual passerby. If each of us, living at various points around the globe, delved deeper into our surroundings, perhaps we too would uncover a fascinating story. Thank you for listening.